Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to your respective locations. And once again, welcome to the fourth webinar of the LORTA Virtual Design Workshop. It's been great to have you along the journey so far, and we're eager to welcome you this time. Thanks again for joining, and we're really eager about this webinar and look forward to more discussions, some great questions and comments to come. If we can go to the housekeeping slide. We're just going to go over the housekeeping things that we always talk about. If everyone can ensure that your mute button is on, just to ensure that we have quality sound running throughout the whole webinar. And as you're already familiar, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat box at any time. And of course, when we get to the Q&A session, we'll have time to allow people to be able to raise your hand on Zoom and be able to come in and interact more with your questions and comments. Let's move on. Now, before we get started, I have an exciting announcement. Some of you have already RSVP'd and registered for it, and thank you for those that have. Starting tomorrow, that's the 28th of September, until the 30th, for 3 days, we have a special training by the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics. This evening, Nate from Busara will be presenting, and all DAs are more than welcome to register and to join us for this training that has been made in order to expand more on what does behavioral science have to do in the climate change context. You can contact ieu.lorta@gcfund.org, which will also be available in the chat box, and you can email us there to register, or even if you have any questions about it. In the training, we'll focus on last mile challenges or the intention action gap. And this will just be extending on the work on projects assumptions, as well as the adoption and uptake of interventions. So we look forward to seeing you there. Great, next slide, please. So you should be familiar with the agenda so far. I'll begin first with a brief summary and a review of the material that was covered in the iLearn videos that you all received. And then joining us today, as I mentioned, we have Nate Peterson from the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, and he'll be leading the presentation as well as a discussion on the 2 readings that were available for this webinar. And then, of course, we'll have our 5-minute break, and then we have 2 great presentations on FP61 as well as SAP20, and this will be followed by a Q&A session for them as well. And then we'll have the greater, deeper Q&A session with Nate as well. And then, of course, we wrap up with the quiz. Next slide, please. And I see that more people have joined in the last couple of minutes, and so welcome back to the webinar, to webinar 4. So what exactly is behavioral science? You've already heard about it in the video, but just a quick review. Behavioral science is the scientific approach to understand decisions and actions through both observation and experimentation. And behavioral science often is thought to be just psychological things, but it's actually an interdisciplinary science that encompasses psychology, anthropology, sociology, and even neuroscience. And behavioral science provides combined insights through this interdisciplinary study for multiple interests. Of course, you may be familiar with behavioral economics. It's used a lot in marketing and mass media. And so, of course, we will be focusing on it more in evaluations for climate change projects. Next slide, please. So if you have heard of Daniel Kahneman, you're familiar with fast and slow, thinking fast and slow, and system 1 and 2. And system 1 is our fast system because it's our much quicker reactionary system. It's our automatic reactions, which are more emotionally fueled. And we tend to use this for more everyday decisions that we're familiar with and that we're comfortable with, that tend to be more part of our routine lifestyle. And because this is our quicker thinking system and more automatic reactions, it does tend to be a bit error prone. And that's because we're not fully engaged always with our more rational and logical side, which is system 2, or our slower thinking system. This, of course, is a lot more conscious system because it takes slower, more awareness to be able to engage in cognitive processes. It takes a lot more effort, and we tend to use the system 2 thinking to address complex decisions. And because of the more rational and logic and based approach, it does tend to be a bit more reliable. Next slide, please. So through this great diagram, you have heard of the intention and action gap. And this outlines how is it that humans think and how is it that humans make decisions. It, of course, starts with a desire, which leads to an intention, and then we take action based on the desire and the intention, and which results in an outcome. But of course, we have the last mile gap, which is the intention action gap. And this can be an internal reason or an external reason where we're not able to meet intention and action immediately or in the time that we planned. And so internal reasons might be individual reasons, or external reasons might be anything that's beyond our control, whether it's the weather, whether there's a policy barrier. It can be at the micro level or at the macro level. Next slide, please. So behavioral change in GCF projects can occur at two different levels. That's at the individual scale, and the individual scale also refers to the household level, or at the institutional scale. And one of the gaps that we hear of the most within project proposals is the resource and capacity gap. This is when there is sufficient resource or where there's an intention to provide resources, but then the capacity isn't up to par with what needs to, with the capacity that's required in order to make full use of the resources that are available. However, ultimately, the capacity to adapt per project scope is certainly limited without action. And so again, this is referring to the intention action gap or the last mile gap. And without action, no matter how much intention or motivation we're driven by, without action, we won't see anything. And of course, project success really depends on beneficiaries maintaining that new behavior after the activities have ended. We're not just investing in projects only for that period, but we really want that change and to be more sustained, therefore sustainable. Next slide, please. So this is not just for GCF projects, but even just in general. Every single project has implications for behavioral change, especially GCF projects. And one of the ways that we can see behavioral change and how we can see the implications for behavioral change is that a change in environment can alter behavior in a much more predictable way. And that's because behavior is actually not as predictable as we tend to think that it is. And in behavioral change, we can see both short-term and long-term effects. And the ultimate aim is to improve decision-making in the long run. Again, we're not investing in projects only for the short term and only for the time period of the project, but ultimately to see the more sustained and sustainable change in the long run. Now, sometimes heuristics and biases can tend to get in the way. Heuristics are cognitive shortcuts that simplify the decision-making process, especially whenever there's uncertainty. You may have read about this in your readings. Heuristics are not a form of optimization, but they're ultimately about looking for an option that appears it's good enough. So we'll settle with this because it's good enough. And so because of that, heuristics can also lead to greater cognitive biases. Cognitive biases, on the other hand, either result of an error in processing information, or they're based on a more self-serving motivation. And the number of biases and heuristics are so many. There's so many biases and heuristics that it's too long to be able to cover in a paper or even through this webinar. But just to give you a couple examples, first we have the availability heuristic, which is about taking the more quickly or taking, thinking of what comes to mind more quickly or readily, because that seems more accessible. And so therefore we tend to make decisions based on whatever seems to be more available more quickly, rather than taking the time with systems 2 to access the comprehensive set of information that we have available to us to evaluate all the options that are there. And so again, as I mentioned, this is referring to system 1 or system 2 thinking. Are we referring to more quick and easily available, easily accessible options? Or are we focused on the system 2, which requires much more deeper cognitive processes? An example of this is that when it comes to climate change, people tend to refer to, even in their memory, they tend to refer to more recent weather patterns as opposed to a longer period of even natural disasters or different weather patterns that we've seen over many years. Now, another bias that we see is anchoring effect. As you can imagine, when an anchor is thrown, the boat is stable and doesn't move. And so the anchoring effect is about how people are heavily influenced by the first piece of information that they receive, even if it's completely irrelevant to the decision that faces them. And so there are people who don't agree that, as an example, there are people that don't agree that climate change is real, and instead of looking for or even properly researching the scientific information that supports this, or even the storylines of testimonies of how people are facing this in different countries, they tend to, if the first thing that they heard was climate change isn't real and so many people are against climate change, without even considering the more comprehensive and scientifically based information, they'll just revert to the first piece of information that they received on it. Now, one of the ways that we can ensure the accuracy of the assumptions that we're making in building the theory of change is in designing projects is to consult with the beneficiaries as well as all the other stakeholders to get their perspectives, to ensure that we're not practicing project design based on our own heuristics and biases, but to be able to get everyone's perspective so that the beneficiaries are ultimately, and also the stakeholders are ultimately getting the most and the best out of the projects. Next slide, please. Now, these are the 5 behavioral evaluation questions that you heard about in the iLearn videos. In step 1, we assess the formation of underlying assumptions in the theory of change. And following that, in step 2, we identify behavioral underpinnings of evaluation questions. In other words, how can we form the evaluation questions in the behavioral context? In step 3, we aim to identify indicators to measure changes in the behavioral outcomes, followed by step 4, where we validate and refine behavioral evaluation questions with stakeholders. And step 5, we'll define the main objectives of the behavioral evaluation. Let's go into some examples of this. So step 1, assessing the formation of underlying assumptions in the theory of change. By now, I assume that you're very familiar with the theory of change, either because you've submitted a project proposal or because you've been working on it through the virtual design workshop. Some examples of this would be, does context or baseline data support the assumptions that are listed in a theory of change that are supporting the different nodes? Or would stakeholders and beneficiaries actually agree with the assumptions that are listed here? Also, what role do behavioral indicators play in the assumptions? Now, the overarching question for this is, which assumptions have informed the project's theory of change? Next slide, please. In step 2, when we want to identify the behavioral underpinnings of evaluation questions, or to look at this in a behavioral context, some examples of the questions that we might ask are, what behaviors contribute to the problem that the project is seeking to solve? In the activities, you may ask, what behavioral interventions have been proposed in achieving the project? Perhaps in the outcomes, you'll ask, what behavioral changes are expected throughout different stages of the project? With the overarching question of which behaviors will persist after the outcomes of interest are achieved. Next slide. Now, I have a confession to make, everyone. and with that confession, I must extend my apologies. In the iLearn video, I stated that persuasion, education, and these other bullet points were actually indicators, but I made a major mistake, and these are actually interventions, not indicators. And so we'll go to the next slide to talk about the actual indicators. Oh, sorry, if we could go back to the previous slide, please. Now, interventions, there are behavioral interventions that can be designed into a project. An example of a behavioral intervention would be in environmental restructuring, for example. Environmental restructuring is about changing the physical or social context to encourage or discourage behavioral change. For instance, we see the smart design of cities And you might see something especially related to the use of energy or public transportation use. In one example of this is that I once heard about a company that created recycle bins that actually have Wi-Fi signals. And so with the Wi-Fi, the recycle bin is able to auto detect how much recycling waste has been put into the bin, and then automatically sends a signal to the company to know how much, like how full it is. And so then the company is able to send out the trucks to pick up the waste. This eliminates the problem of the trucks having to revolve around the whole city to be able to pick up the waste constantly, and is able to target their route based on where the need actually is. And also, this encourages people to spend time near the recycle bins and creates a positive momentum related to the recycle bins, because they're there using the Wi-Fi, but then automatically they assume that through this environmental restructuring, recycling is a great way to live. So another example of an intervention would be modeling. As you can imagine, modeling is something that you provide a model example for people to aspire to or to be able to follow. And as you can imagine, this is something that we use a lot in marketing. So if we're using it in marketing for so many different industries, for so many different sectors and purposes, why not use it for climate change? Why not, rather than the doom and gloom of climate change stories, why are we not sharing more stories on positive examples that we can all collectively or individually aspire to or aim toward? Next slide, please. So now getting to the indicators. In step 3, we want to identify indicators to measure changes in behavioral outcomes. So behavioral change indicators will be impacted by changes in perceived capability or opportunity, which ultimately increases motivation. And when motivation is increased along with capability or opportunity changes, then behavior is changed. Indicators, some examples can be the participation rate of a program or within a program. Also, changes in attitude. Can we measure changes in attitude to assess how behavior has changed over time or because of different triggers? Responses to triggered motivations. And also frequency of action taken. For example, perhaps there's a deforestation rate within a given time period. This would be a behavioral change if we see the different links of deforestation, the different decision-making within the decision-making process, different steps or different decisions that are made to reduce deforestation within that time period. Another example could be the rate of scaling up or of sharing the skills or knowledge in a specific area. Next slide, please. Step 4. In step 4, we'll validate and refine behavioral evaluation questions with all the stakeholders. As I mentioned before, this helps to ensure and just to have some accountability in the accuracy of the assumptions and mechanisms that we're building into the theory of change. Some questions that might be asked for this are, how do we best engage with stakeholders on behavioral interventions? Also, how can we transparently communicate expectations? Specifically to behavioral change, it's really crucial to transparently communicate your expectations so that it's clearly understood that the objectives for behavior change are not for manipulation or forced change, but just to communicate, these are our intentions and this is how we will do it. And the more transparent you are, of course, builds trust in the process. Let's move on to step 5, please. Step 5 is defining the main objectives of a behavioral evaluation. Some questions here are, how long are intended behavioral interventions expected to last? Or who will the interventions benefit the most? And what evidence supports this? And finally, how do the intended interventions impact the project objectives? Now, to go into a greater discussion of leading into the reading discussions, I present my colleague, Nate Peterson from the Busara Center of Economics. And over to you, Nate.
Thanks, Deborah. We're going to the paper review, yeah?
You can present what you've prepared for the slide.
All of these? How much, what's my time then? Sorry, I just want to make sure I know.
Of course, you have roughly 20 minutes.
Okay, and should I get all the way through the papers as well?
Yes.
Just to make sure I'm controlling time. Okay, I will kind of do a speedy version of this. So the purpose of some of these slides is to introduce the ideas kind of behind decision theory and to help separate them within people's minds. So decision theory is simply just an approach that we use to study decision-making tasks along with studying how people respond to them. And we study decision-making because decisions are complex. And unless we do that, we kind of see inputs like information, and then we see what people do, but it can otherwise be a black box unless there unless we have the ability to kind of disaggregate things, not just in terms of steps temporally, but to take apart the pieces where people are judging things that are uncertain, or they're experiencing emotions about them. So we can disentangle these various effects, at least to the degree that we can. And that's the work we have before us as decision theorists. Early decision theory focused on rational human beings. It was very mathematical, almost kind of a calculus of how people process things, meant to, at least initially, fit into microeconomics and into that kind of rational man, Homo economicus type model. And it didn't really take into account people's psychological realities. Next slide, sorry. So it's important for us to disentangle decision theory from behavioral science. So on the one side, decision theory is simply our approach to studying how different types of tasks and decision-making processes kind of create the result that we see as in humans' behavior. And we can understand this through lots of different methods. We can attempt to understand people's willingness to accept risk and even perceive risk in the first place. We can do it through methods like visualization, where we attempt to understand how people see the causal linkages between what they do and what outcomes are. And of course, then we can model these, layer in some assumptions and some degrees of uncertainty, and try to understand what comes out of it, as well as the knowledge that we already have about consistencies in people's behavior. There aren't many of them, but at least the decision theory so far, and with the help of behavioral science, has helped us figure out which ones to look at. And it's usually focused on making optimal choices, which can only happen in contexts where we have values and can state, in fact, what those optimal choices are and how people can be perceived to kind of optimize within them. So behavioral science, on the other hand, is a field that we say interdisciplinary to mean basically any way that you can study how humans make decisions. And this can be, at kind of an anthropology, very human systems level, all the way down to, really, really kind of discrete cognitive science areas. And we can understand this through observation and by running experiments, which is what we do at Busara, both of those. And it's usually focused on the kind of underlying behaviors, and it mixes in lots of different approaches and methodologies, which are meant to help understand what people are doing in specific contexts, so that it can contribute to something a bit more broad in the decision theory space, hopefully, as well as answer the immediate problems. Slide. Just to go through this again really quickly. The inclusion of behavior in decision theory and emotions and all the complexities that come with us as humans in these crazy environments that we find ourselves, we have to understand some subcomponents of how people perceive the decisions in the first place. And so we have to have an understanding of the judgments that people make. And because we have so many of these to make over the course of a minute, let alone an hour or a day or our lifetimes, we have to have these quick tools in order to get through them. So heuristics are actually adaptations that our human brains make to deal with an excessively complex world. I say excessively relative to our cognitive capacity, of course. And these heuristics are mostly great. In fact, we couldn't operate in the world without them. And so they should have no negative connotation, except that sometimes they're very reliable and they can very reliably lead us astray. And we can call these things biases in the way that we process things, but biases are things that we should be aware of in how we deal with the world, that are sort of predictable and therefore, at least theoretically, avoidable. And so, right, heuristics are shortcuts, biases are ones that we think lead us in the wrong direction. We also have an issue of preferences being inconsistent. We can face choices and they can be framed different ways and lead us to make opposite decisions, even though the decision is, should theoretically, mathematically be the same because of the order that options are presented in, or kind of the timeline across which options are given to us, et cetera. And finally, we have to accommodate that we're not these kind of infinitely sophisticated processing machines, right? We have memory limitations, we have processing limitations, we have language limitations, we have emotions that affect all of these things and their ability to function in any given moment. So we're just really complex. And the reason that we need to have so many different methods is because humans have so many different ways of surprising these rational models of how we should behave. Next slide, please. Yeah. So we typically think, again, I'm trying to cruise through these, that we have judgment on one hand, which is the way that people perceive the different aspects in the world, and then preferences on the other, meaning like we have to have values about things and kind of know what we want after we judge them, whether that judgment is right or wrong, and then that leads to individual choices. Slide. And we can have these judgments and we can evaluate whether our judgments are accurate if we kind of make them accurately or at least consistently across time. Meaning that at least we're being predictable even if we're wrong. Go to the next slide, please. And then of course we can have attitudes towards things that we identify, and these attitudes can be based on kind of long held values or social norms, and they help us weigh the desirability of something, right? So it could be that you have a preference for a certain flavor. It could be that you have a preference to align with a certain set of religious beliefs. And those are all things that could feed into your preferences. So there are many different levels. Next slide, please. And so, all of these combine to allow us to make decisions and actually act on things in the world. And we run experiments where we try to isolate the various factors and see which choices arise. And so after we understand the kind of micro mechanisms, both within judgments and within preferences, then it will help us better understand when we do experiments around those higher level choices about the specific behaviors that we care about. Next slide, please. So it's also important to mention that there's a whole lot of work here on how groups make decisions, and they're important because we need to know how to guide groups, especially in the policy space, with how to listen to each other, how to get the most from the diversity that makes up the team, how to make sure everyone's opinions are heard, and then that they're integrated well, and that they also take into account whatever data is available to the decision makers, which is actually an area of my interest I'm working on at the World Agroforestry Center. And we can rely on knowledge of experts, but we need to integrate it well into our decision making. So the gist of this section is that kind of behavioral science methods and decision making models and kind of lines of conceptual thinking suggest that humans are not always so predictable, but we kind of know the areas where we kind of go astray from models. And as such, we need to be observed, and especially in different contexts. And we can't just carry assumptions always from one context to the next. And it's also important that oftentimes we design, interventions, treatments, ways of changing people's decision-making that we might have to engage with people who are not actually the target of what we're trying to change. So for example, if we are, a crude example, it's off the top of my head, if we are trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, that will inevitably have a huge impact, possibly an outsized one relative to income on smallholder farmers here in East Africa, as an example. And so it's really important to understand that we have to talk about the different levels of the different types of preferences we might have depending on the level of engagement that our intervention is taking. And really all we can do is measure this stuff as well as possible along the way, and in fact to know what to measure in the first place, which I think is part of my role today. Next slide, please. Yeah, you can go right to the, so we're going to discuss two papers. And for those of you who read them, I hope that you kind of saw that they were chosen to represent two different levels of how we think about behavior change in the climate change space. So the Gifford et al. Paper, which is 10 years old at this point, and did something really interesting. So first, the authors tried to just make sure that people had this fundamental understanding that making these high-level changes depends on the kind of environmental systems that surround people, these individual human systems in which they're embedded, and then a whole complex network of other decision factors and social norms and rules and laws and their ability to even get things done in certain circumstances. And so, if you read the paper, you could see that there was this nice graphic. And the whole point of this graphic, which they kind of say in the text, is that it's just really complicated and everything is interlinked. And so given that that's the case, we need a couple of ways of thinking about these systems at different levels in order for us to know how to intervene. And I think that's kind of what makes this paper especially nice in framing this for us, is that we know we have to have individual action. We know that we need to have kind of collective group decision making, and we know that they intersect somehow. And so then we need the help of decision theorists who came before us to tell us how that might work, which is where the paper goes next. Like, have the next slide, please. So they kind of talked about these three models, and sometimes when you're from a specific discipline, you might not know when something is like a core piece of another discipline. And so these models, especially number two, the theory of planned behavior, which was Fishbein and Eisen, like these were really core models of human decision making that kind of have come out as predominant models, as early as the kind of mid 70s, and been the subject of huge debates and people's entire careers. And so, kind of discussing them here is important because they've influenced a lot of how cognitive and social psychologists and decision theorists have thought about decision making. And so the first one, knowledge deficit model, is really simple. And it almost seems kind of adorably simple relative to the other two, because it's sort of linear temporally, if you have this, then you have this, and this is the outcome. And it's also what people rely on the most. I sit in a lot of intervention development meetings at all levels, with governments, with agencies, with NGOs, with researchers, and kind of the assumption that knowledge is the way to get the desired decision-making behavior often comes from people with aligned values in the decision-making group. And it's not always wrong. In fact, sometimes it can be very true, and you can have extremely successful interventions based on this model. But the essential idea is that there's environmental knowledge. People understand that something is a problem, some behavior is bad, or some behavior is good. And that should kind of lead people to be concerned about it enough to feel motivated. And then that will in turn create like whatever the pro-environmental behavior is, whatever the desired outcome is. We've motivated sufficiently because we patched the knowledge gap. Again, sometimes true, but the problem with this is that people who work on interventions are often, they've designed their careers around that subject matter. And sometimes they don't realize that other people might not have their same values to the degree at least that they do. The second one here is the theory of planned behavior. And the first iteration of the theory of planned behavior, which, as I said, is a kind of huge fundamental shift in the way that people thought about decision-making when Fishbein and Eisen released it, is that what we had to do is take into account the fact that people have attitudes about whatever the behavior is. There were some social norms dictating whether or not they could act on those attitudes and how publicly. And then they would have to think that if they tried to do something, it would work, right? So they had to have, control. They had to believe that they had some type of like locus of control or ability within themselves to create the outcome that they wanted, or at least take the action that they planned. And so, as I said, this has been the subject of a lot of debate. And in fact, now this is a model that everything kind of impacts the other ones, and the causality and the sort of temporal loops we've realized can go any different direction. We know these components are really critical in understanding behavior, but they can kind of interlink. And then the last one, again, to be quick about this, Fishbein Eisen might roll over if I glossed over them so quickly, but in the interest of time, I'll go to the value belief norm, which is simply that individuals, we assume, have core values, right? They're inside of us, we care about something. And then they have environmental beliefs that are likely based in some part on those values. And they think because of that, there are norms based, upon which everyone should act, and then they behave accordingly. And this is a very useful model, but at a different level. So one of the things I've hoped you've kind of seen in these three models is that the first one is very much based on an individual cognitive processing structure, right? We have information, and this turns into a behavior. Theory of planned behavior says, wait, a lot of our behavior is socially observed, and so has lots of social context that can influence it. And then the value belief norm thinks about these behaviors in a much more collective way. How do we motivate collective action? And that is kind of by default social, but is done in a kind of group type way typically, right? So how do you motivate an entire group to change beliefs, to vote for something, whatever it may be? So anyway, these are three really nice models at different levels of how people consider problems. Next slide, please. Okay. So there are discrepancies between what people say they think is right, or will do, or do, and kind of what people actually end up doing. So there are lots and lots of reasons for this, right? Individuals may not provide it's accurate reports. People will lie about what they've done or what they plan to do because they know the person asking them would judge them. And that could be based on what they think about the group who's asking them the question, or it could be based on the fact that they know they're in a minority, right? In whatever the context is. And again, these social norms can even change, right? Like in the US, suddenly, like, not out of nowhere, but being like racist suddenly became something that people were vocalizing to a degree that was shocking to many of us, enough that we had to move to Kenya over it. In some cases, it was a little tongue in cheek, but not as much as you might think. And the other problem is that individuals might not always, they might have an idea of which behaviors are positive, but not understand their effect. And they might know that some behaviors are kind of negative, but not know the degree to which they're causing problems on the impact side. And so not just in terms of social desirability, but in terms of actual causal knowledge, they can be a little bit wrong and kind of do the wrong things. And another huge problem is that when people think about their environmental behaviors, and I bet all of us, I know for sure I'm guilty of this, and I'm a person who thinks about this stuff pretty much all the time, is that you think about your environmentally related behaviors as a kind of like cluster of how you're representing yourself and your values, right? And so you're thinking, I turn the water off when I'm brushing my teeth, all the way up to I've reduced my air travel to, I'm going to try to, live in a certain type of house with passive cooling or heating, whatever it may be. So we kind of take these things cumulatively and in a very abstract and truthfully, probably, self-aggrandizing, kind of positive way. And for this reason, we can both be a little bit too abstract and disconnected from the impact of our actual behavior. And, when given the option, most people think they're doing better than they are. For the most part, humans can be a little bit biased about their own behavior, in part because we think of all the reasons to justify it. And we also, we want to feel good about ourselves. And so this makes this really, really complicated in terms of measurement. Next slide, please. So the authors, kind of acknowledging these problems and walking us through these models, suggest that there are two ways to think about interventions. And this is kind of like a first stage. One is that we need to think about our informational strategies, and they need to be a little bit more complex, not quite as kind of, one-to-one discrete. We need to change, perceptions, norms, knowledge, attitudes, motivations, all of these things that can underline a particular decision behavior. And we should know how our communications are impacting each of those when we've kind of layered or mashed these things together, because we might be doing one of those well. We might be changing a social norm very well, but then also creating like a motivational deficit, right? Because suddenly we could have a communication that tells people, a group level should be responsible for this outcome. And they're like, yes, it should. I completely agree. This group, whatever it is, even if I'm part of it, should fix this problem. And that could actually reduce their individual motivation, perhaps, because they've kind of put the responsibility on this abstract, amorphous body of humanity, whoever it might be. And they could think, well, since the person is part of that group, they should assume they belong. But they've been able now to create this psychological distance from it that can actually destroy their motivation. And so the point of decision theory, and the reason that we use these behavioral experiments, is to disentangle these components and make sure we're not, doing something we think is great and does in fact change one attitude or assumption about a norm, but then shoots us in the foot, which I think is an Americanism, I don't know. And so the nice thing about informational strategies is that they are in fact very low cost. And in fact, if you go to a behavioral scientist, many of us, the first thing that we try to do is solve problems with different types of informational strategies, because they are in fact, cheap for whoever our client or implementing organization is. And then we can test a couple of them and the combinations of a couple of them to get an understanding of how they're interplaying and which sort of changes they're causing. And so as much as I may be making informational strategies seem too simplistic, they're actually a favored tool. And they're really critical, and they're really critical for designing good, kind of not multimodal interventions, if you will. And then on the structural side, people have maybe heard the term choice architecture, but we essentially need to allow people to take actions, and make sure that the actions we're suggesting are possible for them to take in the context, and that we've considered all of the obstructions and have addressed them in advance. And that's actually one really critical component. I work in agriculture risk mitigation, and we tell farmers that one of the best things they can do is to invest in maybe solar irrigation. But then we find out that that's in some cases really cost prohibitive, and they would need to create these kind of collectives in order to afford a system, for example. But then we don't solve that, right? And then we see, oh, people aren't taking up this really adaptive behavior. Why not? Well, we didn't think through their structural barriers and solve those first. And so these are most effective, and when the situation is what's preventing people, but there are almost always structural issues to at least address, if not, kind of fundamentally change before an informational strategy is optimized. What's my time left, Deborah?
So that was at about 20 something minutes. So maybe just a couple more minutes.
Sure. Great.
Thank you.
I get excited about this stuff. It's hard. So you can go to the next slide after this one. So then, Gifford et al. Try to leave us with some suggestions, right? How do we actually know what to encourage and which things to choose? So we can kind of find behaviors that are causing a negative impact, but then we have to understand feasibility of our recommendations, make sure we've really aligned and adequately considered the target population. We have to make sure we've understood all of the factors for the decision maker in that situation so that they are, completely aligned with us on what they should do, but unable to do it. And then we need to make sure that we are targeting the structural stuff often first, but sometimes in conjunction with the informational components, if those are critical. And then, of course, we need to measure so that we can know what the impacts were like and how they played against each other, which is why we tend to rely on experiments, because then you can look at things separately and together and get an understanding of all those effects individually. Next slide, please. Again, I'm gonna cruise through these discussion points a bit, but important things to consider. Which types of outcome measures that you've used in projects, right? Were these self-reported? Were they proxy? Were there kind of any limitations? Did you look at observable things or just self-reports? If you did both, did you match them up with each other? Some of this stuff seems quite obvious, right? When someone says it, but it is often not the case that these things kind of lay over each other, possibly because of financial limitations and these sorts of things, but still to be considered and recommended by any behavioral scientists of good conscience. So the kind of next question here is, between informational and structural strategies, which do people think can be more effective kind of areas for behavioral science? And again, I hope we can come back to these in just a minute. Deborah will let us know on the timekeeping. And then I'm assuming people have, but have you used informational strategies in projects? And what were the limitations? And do you have any immediate intuitive or even really clear and explicit ways of improving impact if we were to do them over? And how did you learn? How did you come to those conclusions? Next slide, please. So I'm gonna go again through this paper, the second one, in which we get much more into the sort of meat of the behavioral barriers and the decision theory, heuristics and biases, the kind of more nitty-gritty side of thinking about questions. But first, we kind of lead off here with something that's a bit more conceptual. And yeah, the second reading is available. You should know that Martin and I were both authors of this paper on this paper. So we'll freely hand it out to anyone who is ready to read. So, as Deborah highlighted, I'm sorry, I'm under a metal roof in a forest. She highlighted the fact that there's often this intention action gap where we want to do something and we don't quite follow through with it. And we know conceptually that there are lots of reasons, and these are the bubbles. So present bias is one in which we're thinking a lot more about now than the future. Loss aversion, we would much rather kind of not lose something than gain something of the same size to a higher relative degree. Self-efficacy and identity, which tie together in lots of circumstances. So self-efficacy being to what degree do you think you can do something, achieve something? And often that ties in with identity because we're often constrained by identity characteristics, gender, ethnicity, which country we live in, et cetera. Groupthink is actually when groups kind of rely on these group heuristics and social norms and come to conclusions that aren't fully considered. And we'll talk about how in a minute. Motivation, and then cognitive overload, which is when we can end up having too much info. And so what you're seeing here in the bars are some of the specific kind of disaggregated decision science ways that the bars create the bubbles, right? So present bias could be that when we're making a judgment, we're kind of overly discounting the future. Okay, perfect, thanks. Loss aversion can be that we have this thing called sunk cost effect, which is that when we've kind of already valued something or already spent money on it, you know, having a sense of loss or that thing not working out can be exacerbated. Same thing with kind of, you know, program inadequacy, right? We think something's not working out, so we just, you know, kind of want to drive it so the whole thing isn't a waste. So that relates closely to sunk cost. Social comparison and norms. You know, as I had said before, a lot of our perception of self-efficacy is based on our group belonging, which is of course driven by what we see other people in our group doing, and of course what the overarching norms are for that group, as well as, you know, our individual values about things in the world, as well as the social values that our group says they have. And then kind of in the group decision making, we can end up kind of dealing with mistrust of whoever a decision maker is, or mistrust in a structure such that we don't think we can speak up. And we might avoid conflict because we don't want to suggest that our values are different from the group. And, you know, we can be misaligned in lots of ways that can actually lead us to sort of fall in line and let the group just drive forward with the first assumption it comes to. And then finally, on cognitive overload, people just don't have infinite time, and some decisions are really complicated. And so we can rely on behavioral momentum, which is just keep doing the same thing more and more. And then, you know, kind of lack of perceived behavioral control, which is that we don't think we can actually take an action to create the outcome we want. And even thinking about how that might work is overwhelming to us and overloads our minds. It's kind of a high level outline of the concepts in that paper. Next slide, please. So how do we get around some of these things, which are really tough, right? I mean, that's just a whole litany of problems I gave you. One that is often overlooked, actually, and in part because people try it and it doesn't always go well, because there's lots of nuance, is non-monetary incentives. How can we recognize people who perform really well in groups, and without just giving them money as a reward, but making that performance or that good behavior a more core part of their identity, such that, you know, they kind of help proselytize it maybe, or they just continue demonstrating it to everyone else. And it also makes people feel good that we acknowledge what they've done already and how it's helped the people around them. We can do things called situational targeting, and information interventions often miss this component, right? We might know that there's a knowledge gap that we need to fill, and we can try to fill it at lots of different points in time, lots of different times a day, different points in crop cycles, different points in you know, kind of the annual calendar, holidays. There's all sorts of considerations. And so situational targeting is simply the idea that we can deliver messages, especially at points in time in which people are most apt to, you know, kind of perceive them, process them, and have their values aligned with them so that they operate on them. And so that's what situational targeting is. And so sometimes the same piece of information can be tested across different points in time to understand how it might be optimized. And again, you can't go back, well, this has been perfect in 2017, but knowing that this intervention is best immediately post-harvest, you can tell I'm an agriculture economist, I'm sorry. Immediately post-harvest is an example of a time where a particular intervention could work really well. And finally, we can focus on changing group norms, right? So sometimes people have perceptions of group norms that are just sort of unquestioned almost. People don't really talk about them, and everyone operates under those assumptions. But, you know, given changes in environmental cues, we'd call them, but the environmental structure, people as a group might be prone to change their mind about something, but no one's discussing it. And so creating those conversations so groups can kind of adapt their collective behavior can often be really useful in creating behavior change. Next slide, please. So how does this actually map on to what researchers do? And this is, you know, in some ways, the way that Busara approaches these types of questions, and it, you know, attempts to help agencies and other types of implementers. So at the planning stage, the early stage, we usually conduct what we call formative research. Other people call it formative research too, obviously. And it just helps us get an understanding of what the context look like and the things that are affecting people's decisions. We look at people's attitudes, their kind of perceptions, judgments, and what their motivations are at often an individual level. We collect lots of information on the types of beneficiaries that we might be focusing on, and try to understand who they're looking to when they're making a decision of this type. Now, on the project side, we go deeper. We want to know exactly how these individuals are assessing risks, and not just the risk that we're focused on, but where does the risk that we might be trying to motivate someone to adapt to or to mitigate come in terms of their entire body of risks that they're working on, right? Humans have complex lives, and oftentimes interventions forget that this might be someone's 17th problem, not their number one problem. So we need to understand where the things that we're addressing even fall into people's priorities, and if we can move them around, and to get a clearer sense of beliefs and where those beliefs are coming from. And so we also have to understand all these contextual factors, so we know if there are biases or inaccurate perceptions or whatever they are, where they're coming from and how we might influence them in the first place. And this is the point at which we develop something and say, we've refined this a lot, but we still need to do a small pilot to make sure that, we're not wrong, right? So behavioral science helps you narrow down to a few ways of approaching a problem instead of all of them. But then this piloting phase is still often necessary. And so when we implement them when we go to implementation, we want to kind of strike really well right away, right? We want to make sure that our initial intervention kind of carries a lot of weight and is as successful as possible at scale, in part because of efficiency. And everyone's like, yeah, everyone's intervention, they want to be as successful as possible. But the reason this is so critical is that kind of, these social norms and things like, trust in whoever the intervention creator are very fragile. And so we need to make sure that it's not just economically efficient, but that, it will likely have lasting and longer term impacts if we do well right away. And this could involve, technical capacity building with intervention partners or communities, et cetera. And to also think about the types of incentives that whoever the beneficiaries or the people implementing the treatment might need to have lined up. As we depart, money isn't infinite, unfortunately. And so even thinking about the social incentives, is often the best way of creating truly sustainable outcomes, or having great economic systems come together that kind of organically, for whenever you want to value capitalism, can lead people in the right direction over long periods of time. And so in this place, we want to make sure that we don't just rely on these sorts of financial or economic incentives, but always consider them balanced with people's intrinsic, and kind of social motivations, so that we're doing the thing kind of most comprehensively and also most efficiently in terms of cost. Next slide, please. So the question that we pose here is, do you expect any types of behavioral biases in your project? And which ones, right? There are often lots. People demonstrate many biases, even over the course of a single minute of the day. And so the question is just, have you considered which ones? And if so, can you describe them and how they operate on the project? And do you see the value of using behavioral science? And of course, no one's like, Nate, this is terrible. We wouldn't have a confrontation over Zoom. But the point is, like, what do you think is the actual value of behavioral science, right? I develop projects in lots of sectors over the kind of entire world with highly varying budgets. And sometimes I've been told, right, like behavioral science and this optimization seems great, but can we afford it, right? Can we afford, research as 5, 10, 20% of this budget? And sometimes those are very fair questions. And so I ask this in a way that almost seems amusing coming from me, but it's true, right? Is there a good ROI on that in your project? And if not, why not? Next slide, please.
Great.
That's
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Yep.
Nate. Really quick, before we jump into our 5-minute break, Nate threw some great discussion questions out there, and we'll perhaps just because of time, we'll return to these after the break. But if you have any questions, of course, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And we actually had a couple questions, I believe, that were sent earlier. I'm just going to scroll up to look for them. So one question was, regarding extrinsic barriers that cause an intention and action gap, would they still relate to behavior?
Yeah. That's a great question, and one I actually personally work on quite a bit, often through thinking about things like referral incentives or agent incentives for people to go out. So they're extrinsic behaviors in the sense that, you know, people are expecting a financial reward for creating change in others, right? And so oftentimes what we need to do is help motivate those messengers to take a message to the potential beneficiaries in a really effective way. And now here's the problem. We really like to oversell solutions to things, right? You know, this is absolutely, if you haven't, you know, I keep using agriculture examples. I apologize, but this is just where my brain is. If you use this drought resistant maize seed, you know, you will definitely have better germination rates, therefore better harvests. And it's just so obvious. But what happens is we end up selling that as like this perfect solution and tell people the 99th percentile outcomes. And I've seen many interventions that, and I've said this before, that materially improve beneficiaries' lives in ways measured by income, by education outcomes, by nutritional outcomes. And they're still upset about them. And they don't carry on those behaviors because we've created such a hard sell that they end up disappointed. And so knowing exactly where to find that balance between overselling and you know, underselling expectation setting is so critical. And that's actually one of my biggest learnings in working on so many of these projects, is that you know, even model farmers, model whomever, you have to be careful with who is the model.
Thank you so much, Nate. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm just gonna reread the discussion questions, and it'd be great to hear back from those of you who have been listening. Do you expect any of the behavioral biases to be present in your project? If yes, which ones? And what can be done to reduce the impact? Another great question that Nate has raised is, do you see the value of using behavioral science in your project? I'm personally curious. I wish we had all the time to be able to hear this for all the projects that are present. And so if anyone would like to bring in some input from their projects, it'd be great to hear from you. In the meantime, if you do have any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. Nate, I actually have a question for you. In all of your experience with designing interventions and sitting in all these meetings with different sectors, if you could pinpoint anything about either biases or about designing interventions, what is the, this is, mm-hmm. I almost hate to say it this way, but what is the one thing that you wish everyone could know?
Mm-hmm. So I even jumped out alluding to this at the start of this kind of conversations, which is that the people designing interventions often have similar values, and they also have, because they speak, and even in the course of designing interventions, they can arrive at these sort of coherent, cohesive models of causality of what people are thinking and why, and they can be wrong, right? And you can feel like that this must be so true, that this is what's happening with your population, and everyone agrees in the room, which kind of gets at this groupthink idea. And then when you go out, finding out that you're wrong. And what people do is point to kind of structural breakdowns, or, you know, this wasn't implemented perfectly. This is because this NGO didn't quite have this on the ground the way that they said they were going to. But sometimes it's actually those fundamental assumptions that went wrong from the outset because it was too many experts in a room with similar language and similar everything. And that's the biggest thing, is question who's developing these interventions. Even as a behavioral scientist, right? I can be a disaster at intervention development when I'm left to my own devices, because I know which thing is the question, but I have a specific language that can really not hit well in the field.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And I actually think that when it comes to applying behavioral science within the climate change context, it's almost like the reverse case where so many experts or people that have done a lot of research or have experience in implementing behavioral interventions, for us, it might seem so clear, like, how can we, if climate change itself is an anthropogenic issue, then why would we not bring in behavioral science? It almost doesn't make sense to us, right? But then it's still, after all these years of organizations and offices and administrations and so many different levels of implementation, trying to bring in behavioral science, there's still so much skepticism of, but does behavioral science really have anything to do with climate change? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and we face this constantly, even internally at Busara, right? So, as I've said 5 times already, I work a lot on helping farmers take risk mitigation behavioral strategies and understand how they perceive those kind of in their causal models of what they can do about the environment and what they can do to both change it and adapt to it. And ultimately, we can't speak to them about these environmental things that we value so much, right? And we know are core. And so I have to leave all of my language at the door and kind of snap into marketing mode, right? And people kind of will come in at Busara and join a project, and they're really eager and excited, and we're gonna work on some of these environmental issues that keep us all up at night. And then they're like, this is a marketing project, and we're dissecting it a bit more into people's cognitive mechanisms, but this seems very salesy at the end of the day. And it is, right? And so I think that can end up being the disconnect, is that you still have to speak to people on their values, right? Smallholder farmers care about income so they can feed their families and educate them. And you can't forget people's kind of ordering of immediate values.
Thank you so much for that. I don't see any more questions that have been added to the chat box. And also, just considering time, I think now would be a great moment to take the 5-minute break. When we come back, we'll be hearing from the 2 different projects, and also we'll have more time for a Q&A. And so we'll go on a 5-minute break now. Thank you so much, everyone.
Great.
So we're almost at time for after the break, so we'll just give it a few more seconds and it'll be time to resume. Great. So welcome back, everyone. Now we're going to go into the presentations for the two projects. And just a reminder for those who will be presenting, if we could go back to the previous slide, please. We'll have each presentation will be approximately 10 minutes. And so 10 minutes for FP061 and 10 minutes for SAP20. And then if there are any questions, we can go into 5 minutes for each one. And then we'll move on from there. And so first we'll hear from FP061. And I believe that will be Matthias, am I correct?
Yes, perfect.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay, yes, so I present on the behalf of FP61. This is a project in Antigua, in Barbuda, Dominica, and Grenada. And this is a really complex and big project. And so for the impact evaluation, we focus on one of 4 components, one which is at the community level rather than the national or state level. Next slide, please. Yes, so the component the impact evaluation will focus on is some grant component where money is provided to communities to reinforce or build up shelters, natural disaster shelters, renewable energy systems, and other type of infrastructure in order to improve climate resilience, and as well as providing training for shelter management best practices. So I guess this is a good example for this, why we talk about behavioral interventions, because this project both provides like the infrastructure, but if we look at the outcomes, we see that these are deeply linked to changes in behavior, and we cannot expect the infrastructure investments alone to result in the goals, in the ultimate goals of the intervention. So we dug a bit deeper into the behavioral component in the training related to this intervention. Next slide, please. Okay, so the theory of change is maybe not, or after this talk, maybe like after the presentation earlier, maybe a bit straightforward. So the input on the activity is to provide the training, and then we hope that after the training that the community members are actually trained in these practices, which hopefully will lead them to be more knowledgeable and able to apply these best practices. Of course, knowledge is not the same as application, and so the next causal link with a lot of assumptions is basically from knowledge to applying the best practices, and ultimately from applying the best practices, we hope that the communities are more climate resilient in face of natural disaster. So during the discussions this week, we thought about several assumptions. So we need for community members to be trained. We need that the community members want to participate in the training, and that has a lot of sub-assumptions basically behind this. We want all the groups that are targeted, women, men, vulnerable people in these communities to know about the training opportunity, and also to have time and be able to access the trainings. And of course, they would need to be willing and interested. And at the moment also, we would hope that COVID protocols would still allow for these trainings to take place or not adversely affect the conduction of these trainings. So this would hopefully lead to community members who are trained in these management practices. And of course, the underlying assumption is that this training improves the knowledge in shelter management. Also, the intervention hopes that the trained community members will themselves train further community members. So basically that the intervention can be ongoing and doesn't need to be, has a bit more of a sustained effect. And then from knowledge to application, basically if there's a knowledge gap that this theory presented earlier by Nathan, sometimes it's just enough to, Nathaniel, it's just enough to fill the knowledge gap, but often other things are in the way. And of course, the necessary infrastructure needs to be available to apply these best practices. And finally, in order for these best practices to lead to more climate resilience, these best practices need to be in such a way that they actually lead to improved resilience, which probably will be the case, but also since these are, so that's one thing of basically applying the best practices throughout the year, but then also the important issue of if these can get or will be applied during or in case of a disaster where everything is basically scrambled around. So we thought about the following evaluation questions for this intervention, maybe on the next slide, please. Yeah, so the overall behavioral questions we thought about was to what extent do the trainings increase knowledge and application of the shelter management best practices, and to measure these, to measure whether the trainings affected these in the desired direction. We can look at test scores of knowledge tests about these practices, but also about the ability or like a demonstrated ability to replicate the best practices as well. And so for some best practices that are done throughout the year, we can observe them or rely on reports, and also maybe in case a disaster hits, we can also look at these more whether these best practices are practiced in case of a disaster. So we subdivided the question for along the theory of change into several sub-questions. So we look at to what extent the community members are trained, measured by the number of women and men registered trained, and also those who completed the training. And this can already give insights into what we might want to look at further. So basically, maybe the training only women or only men register for the training, and then the intervention could be adapted in case there is some gender disbalance. The next step is basically this idea that the trainees should train the other community members, and this could be measured by the number of training workshops executed by previously trained members. Again, here we could already early on see whether whether there's buy-in from the trained community members, whether they want to share the practices, whether they are convinced, and then of course whether the training actually increases knowledge based on test scores or some demonstrated test replication of these best practices. And again, right, this is now a kind of one-dimensional theory of change, but of course this can go over several years with several steps and repetitions. So maybe the training could be, or further rounds of training could be adapted if it turns out that some of these, if the training as it was implemented did not increase the knowledge, then maybe through these questions, through this formative research, for example, one could look deeper into how to change these modalities, training modalities. Yes, and then of course from knowledge to practice, we could assess the perception of the community members, basically if they are willing to apply the trained practices throughout the year, but also during disaster. And so it would be valuable to assess the perceptions and opinions of the trainees on the applicability and the usefulness of these best practices. The training itself is already, as far as I understand, has this participatory approach, but it's still good to expose, maybe evaluate how people think about what they are supposed to apply. And then finally, what the training ultimate goal is that people apply these best practices, and this could be measured by reported or observed application of best practices by community members. Okay. And this would be the theory of change of this component with all these sub-questions. Of course, additional questions could be how these training could be structured or changed in terms in order to improve upon these indicators. Thank you. And if there are any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And as he mentioned, if anyone has any questions, it'd be great to have them in the chat box, or also feel free to raise your hand. And now, if there are no questions, we'll go to Carly for SAP 20. And in the meantime, if there are questions, you can still put them in the chat box.
Okay, I'm ready, Deborah, when you are.
Over to you, Carly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, everyone, I'm happy to be presenting SAP 20 on behalf of the Micronesian Conservation Trust. And I'm going to try and do this in about 5 minutes. So let's see. Next slide. Okay, so this is climate resilient food security for farming households across the Federated States of Micronesia. There are 3 main components to this project, but I do want to highlight something first about the context of Micronesia, which I find really interesting. About 63% of households conduct some form of agriculture across the islands. But here's the thing, very few of those households actually identify themselves as farmers. And so what does that mean? That means these are subsistence activities. It means they aren't engaging with markets. They aren't selling their products to the markets. They aren't trying to figure out how to commercialize this output. They aren't figuring out how to create even production throughout the year. And that also feeds into the nutritional aspects and dietary decisions of people on the islands as well too. So this is a multi-prong project, which is very interesting. It's looking at not only from the supply side, but also the demand side. How do we create locals who are desiring local products? There's estimations that between 17 and nearly 50% of the diet in Micronesia is imported foods. And that's imported things like rice, noodles, ramen. So it's not providing or increasing the dietary diversity of the local population. And this project is really trying to get at that. So those 3 components include establishing an enabling environment. Second one is enhancing the food security of vulnerable households by introducing climate smart agricultural practices. And the third one, the one we're going to focus on, is strengthening climate resilient value chains. Next slide, please. So the next slide is the theory of change, which I think no one has yet to figure out how to present a theory of change in a really concise way. So I'm just gonna do a little summary here and say we're talking about strengthening climate resilient value chains, and our inputs are, incorporating these participatory guarantee system groups. Think of them, if you hadn't come across the term before, think of them a bit like farmers cooperatives. Incorporating them, getting farmers to write business plans, getting a gender balance across the participants, and also even in the leadership within these organizations. And then we're talking about increasing coordination as one of the outcomes of these outputs of these activities, improving the gender balance, all of this coming together, greater commercialization of agriculture coming together to increase productivity, and all of that ending up with greater food availability, greater access, and greater stability of that food. So a lot of this, can we jump to the next slide, please? A lot of this actually does have to do with, let's see, actually even go to the next slide, has a lot to do with behaviors. So I wish Lisa was here to talk about it. In Micronesia, the culture is very strong and very distinct across each of the islands. So that presents a really interesting problem for us. Also, when we start to talk about things like sample size, but nevertheless, there are components of the culture that are consistent across all of the islands. And so thinking about the main two aspects of this, strengthening the value chain, the two things that we wanted to focus on and that we thought could benefit from behavioral interventions were the farmer business plans. We picked farmer business plans because we saw them as that first step towards greater commercialization, towards farmers thinking of themselves as farmers. So of course, we thought, okay, if we could give them money for completing their business plan, that'd be great. Of course, as Nathaniel said earlier, money is not infinite, and we need to think of more creative ways. So Lisa told us that in Micronesia, there's a great culture around celebrating and coming together as a community to celebrate accomplishments. So we said, okay, let's play on that. Every time a farmer or a PGS group finishes their business plan, let's bring people together. Let's make it a social event where we celebrate it, where we're giving out stickers that people can put on their cars, or they can put on a sign on the side of the road that they can show everyone else. Also, we talked about a certification card so that those farmers could then show market owners that they have completed a business card, that they are, they're taking this seriously. They're going forward with being a more formal producer. And then the second element that we also looked at was gender balance. So depending on the island, there's large differences. They can be very matriarchal or very patriarchal. And so we try to think, how could we create a space where women would feel accepted and encouraged? And we realized that that would happen with the leadership. If women could see other women in leadership roles, then they would feel maybe that the PGS was a safe place for them to bring up their concerns or bring up their issues, or to just participate in general. So we decided to go with a default mechanism. So when these PGSs are legalizing themselves with the local government, we decided that the default would be that less than 1/3, about 30% of their leadership committee would be made up of women. We would produce the materials, all of the communication would talk about the fact that that is the default. And only then would we, I'm so sorry, someone just tried to call me, I apologize. Only then would an organization have to try and physically opt out, which would include them writing a small paragraph about why it wasn't possible for them to include 1 to 2 women. It's a small activity, but it does create somewhat of a hurdle for them to not include women on their leadership board. Next slide, please. So actually, let's go to the next slide. These are the questions that we talked about. But really, I would just want to show you, going back to the theory of change, these green highlighted areas are the assumptions that we are trying to get at with our behavioral interventions. So mainly that assumption that farmers and market owners are incentivized and motivated to change. So a really strong culture around what has been done and what is being done is what should continue to be done. And so we need to motivate these farmers to change. And our behavioral intervention around societal recognition and celebration is what we're trying to tackle. And then on the bottom there, I apologize. You can see that we're trying to create a safe space for women so that they can see themselves reflected in the leadership. Okay, I'm going to cut it off there. I think 7 minutes. I apologize.
Thank you so much, Carly, and especially considering that it is a bit challenging to be able to produce, to be able to share about a theory of change in such a concise time. I think you did a great job while still covering quite a lot of content. So thank you so much for that. I see that we still have no questions in the Q&A box yet, or in the chat box yet. I'm sorry. Does anybody have any questions or would like to raise their hand? I know we've covered a lot of content, and we've even received some direct messages about the different presentations. And so thank you so much for that. And if we don't have any questions right now, I think just in consideration of your schedules and of the time, we can jump into the quiz. And before we begin the quiz, I just want to remind everyone, we have received a lot of direct messages about the different presentations and just about the behavioral part of the interventions. And so once again, thank you for that. And just a reminder that beginning tomorrow, in about 23 to 22 and a half hours from now, we'll have the training, the 3-day training. It is over 3 days, but each session will only be an hour. And so beginning tomorrow, we have from 9 to 10 p.m. in Korean time. You can register by emailing this address that's on the slide, ieu.lorta@gcfund.org. And the 3-day training will be held by Busara. Nathaniel is the Vice President of Partnerships, and so Busara will be presenting this training for the 3 days. And we'll be covering, in day 1, we'll be covering the basics of behavioral science, going into a little bit more depth than we've gone into today. And then in day 2, we'll go into barriers and levers. And then day 3, we'll go more specifically into behavioral science in climate change. We've also received some questions on, because of different schedules and time zones, if it's possible to join specific sections, or if it's a mandatory requirement that you join all 3 hours. Of course, you will reap the benefits the most by joining all 3 hours, but please feel free to register, even if you're only able to join because of your schedule or for any other reason. But of course, we would love to have you participate in all 3 hours. And so we'll go into the quiz now. And I would just also like to say thank you to everyone for your time. The quiz code is in the chat box. If you can go to menti.com, and the code is 36161919. That's 36161919. Great. Let's begin. Quiz 4. We've had some great competition so far, and I'm really curious how things will go today. All right. Question. Wow, we've already had so many join. We'll give it just 5 more seconds for a few more to join. 3, 2, 1. And if you do need the code, it's 36161919. Okay, let's begin. Wow, a lot of joiners at that second. Oh, we don't have a leaderboard just yet. We'll go to question 1. I guess in those extra seconds, there was an opportunity for more people to join. All right. Remember, the faster you answer, the faster you get points. True or false? Human behavior is mostly predictable with well-calculated assumptions. Is it true or false? Human behavior is mostly predictable with well-calculated assumptions. We've talked about assumptions a lot, and we've talked about if human behavior is predictable or not. And I did extend the time for each question just by a couple seconds. All right, 3, 2, 1. Let's see what we've got. Wow, this is indeed false. Congratulations. Let's see who is the fastest at answering. Oh man. Whoa, look at that competition. Almost everyone answered at the exact same time. I can see this is going to be a great quiz. Let's move on. Question number 2. Let's see what it is. What is the last mile gap? I hope we have 100% on this. Are they challenges in finalizing the steps to completion or barriers of delivery to the end beneficiary of a project? Or is the last mile gap a divide between intention and action? Or maybe none of the above. Maybe there's something off about every one of the answers, or maybe it's one of the answers. What is the last mile gap? We have 5 more seconds. And who's it gonna be? Nice, it is indeed a divide between intention and action. Who's on the leaderboard now? Wow. It's still quite similar, but it looks like Magic Rhino, Magical Rhino is in the lead. Let's go to question 3, please. Question 3 says, oh, this leaderboard is really excited. We'll just go back to question 3. You can just wait for the countdown. What are good practices regarding stakeholders in using behavioral evaluation questions? Stakeholders, including beneficiaries, have been mentioned a few times. And so good practices, do they include that some good practices would be to communicate transparently about projections? Or is it about accountability in order to ensure accuracy on the assumptions that are used to build into the nodes? Or is it to support behavioral maintenance of beneficiaries after the activities end? Or perhaps the answer is all of the above, all 3 of these. 3, 2, 1. What's the answer? Congratulations, it is all of the above. I have a feeling the stakes are going to be close again. We're going to see some close competition. Wow. That's great. Congratulations, everyone. Okay, let's go to question 4. We'll just wait for the timer. Question 4 says, true or false, behavioral theory is an analytical approach to study the properties of rational tasks or decisions. Behavioral theory is an analytical approach to study the properties of rational tasks or decisions. You have about 20 seconds to answer. This might be a trick statement, or it might be really clear to you. Behavioral theory is an analytical approach to study the properties of rational tasks or rational decisions. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. What's it going to be? The answer was actually false, because it is an analytical approach to study the properties of tasks or decisions, but it's not exclusive or specifically just the rational tasks or decisions. Let's go into the leaderboard, please. Just as a reminder that humans are irrational beings, and so it is studying both. Wow. This really stirred up the competition this time. Okay. Congratulations, Annabella. Next question, please. Question 5, we're almost there. Changes in perceptions, norms, knowledge, attitude, and motivations. Is this about informational support or structural support? You may remember from Nate's presentation. Informational support or structural support? Changes in perceptions, norms, knowledge, attitudes, and motivations. Which one could this be about? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the answer is informational support is correct. The leaderboard's been different for every question. All right. Great. Let's move on to the next question. We're almost there. The questions might get easier or they might get harder. Where does behavioral science fit into different phases of GCF projects? Is it planning and implementation, planning and conception, planning and perceptions, development of interventions, of projects, of motivations, or capacity building of projects, implementation of projects, or incentives of projects? Which of these three options is the best option for where behavioral science fits into different phases of GCF projects? Implementation, interventions, and capacity building, conception, projects and implementation, or perceptions, motivations, and incentives? And the answer is, great job, everyone. Conception, projects, and implementation. I'm so curious about this leaderboard. It's been an exciting quiz so far. Annabella's keeping up with the lead. All right, the last question. This is the most challenging question. Question number 7. The additional 3-hour training by Busara will be held on what dates? And of course, you have the email address there to RSVP or register. Is it the 24th to the 26th of September, the 28th to the 30th of October, or the 28th to the 30th of September? Just a reminder that today is the 27th of September. And just a reminder, as you can see from all three options, they all say 9 to 10 p.m. Korean time. So I wonder what date and what time the training will be held on. We have roughly 6 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The answer is it starts tomorrow, the 28th of September. Okay, who's on our leaderboard? It's gonna be close, I can feel it. Wow. Annabella and Paul H was so close. Annabella, congratulations. Would you like to reveal yourself so we can congratulate you? Annabella, congratulations from FP 149. Okay, great. While Annabella has her camera on, if we can all turn on our camera so we can take our group photo for webinar 4. And as we're all doing that, just want to say thank you all so much for sticking around and for joining us this webinar. If you do have any questions throughout the week, please feel free to email or reach out to your specialist during the breakout sessions. And they'll be able to email us or answer them directly as well. Great. All right, we're going to count down. 3, 2, and 1. We're going to do one more just as a backup. 3, 2, 1. Great. Thank you so much, everybody. It's great to have you join us. It's always great to hear about your breakout sessions and to just have you join us in the sessions. And I look forward to hearing more about your projects. And we'll see you next week at the same time, same place. Thank you, everyone.